During a catastrophic hurricane, a teenage boy plunged off a cliff and vanished into the raging Atlantic. His father, a feared general, didn't just call for help, he mobilized an armored division and redirected spy satellites, convinced his son had been taken. While soldiers tore the city apart, the boy was lying on a kitchen table in a remote houseboat, his chest cut open. A reclusive nurse was using a fillet knife and vodka in a desperate attempt to keep him breathing. When the general finally kicked down the door with his assault rifle raised, he was 1 second away from killing the only person who could save his child. What happened next shattered Man of Steel and exposed a miracle nobody saw coming. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are watching from in the comments. The storm did not merely arrive in Iron Bay, it besieged it. This was a city forged in steel and baptized in salt water, a grim industrial port where the skyline was a jagged row of rusting cranes and smokestacks that usually belched gray into gray. But tonight, the smoke was choked off by a wind that screamed like a dying god. The Atlantic Ocean, usually a cold neighbor, had turned into an invading army. Rain fell in sheets so dense they looked like solid walls of lead, hammering against the asphalt and the corrugated iron roofs of the dockyards. The streetlights flickered and died, surrendering the city to a chaos of lightning and abyssal darkness. It was a night when wise things burrowed deep and hid. But Leo Sterling was not wise tonight. He was desperate. Leo Sterling was 17 years old, though in the flash of lightning his face looked younger, terrified and pale. He was built like a willow branch, lean and elegant, with the long, calloused fingers of a violinist. Hands meant to create beauty, not to grip the handlebars of a roaring Ducati motorcycle with lethal force. He wore a heavy leather jacket that cost more than most people in Iron Bay earned in a month, but it was unzipped, flapping violently in the gale, soaking the silk shirt underneath. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead inside his helmet, sweat mingling with the tears he refused to acknowledge. He tore down Coastal Highway 1, the engine of the bike screaming in harmony with the wind. He wasn't driving, he was fleeing. The argument with his father, General Magnus Sterling, still rang in his ears, louder than the thunder. The general's voice had been a sledgehammer, smashing Leo's acceptance letter to the conservatory, smashing his self-worth, smashing the very idea that Leo could be anything other than a soldier. "You are weak," his father had said. "You are a Sterling. We do not play pretty songs. We conquer." Leo twisted the throttle. The speedometer climbed. 80, 90. He couldn't see the road, only the blur of rain and the ghosts of his father's expectations. He wanted to outrun the voice. He wanted to outrun the shame of being the disappointment in a lineage of warriors. Ahead, the road snaked dangerously around the cliffs known as the Devil's Elbow. Locals called it the Dead Man's Curve. It was a sharp, unforgiving look, where the asphalt hovered precariously over a 100-foot drop into the jagged teeth of the shoreline below. Leo saw the turn too late. A gust of wind, stronger than the rest, slammed into the side of the motorcycle like a physical blow. The tires lost their grip on the slick, oil-stained pavement. For a split second, time suspended itself. Leo felt the bike slide out from under him, felt the sickening weightlessness of gravity taking over. The guardrail, rusted and neglected, groaned as the metal machine slammed into it, shearing through the bolts. Leo didn't scream. He just thought with a strange and sudden clarity, "I am going to fly." He separated from the bike. The machine tumbled into the dark void, exploding into sparks as it hit the rocks below. Leo followed a second later, a ragdoll tossed by the storm, falling through the rain, down toward the unforgiving embrace of the angry sea. 2 miles down the coast, tucked into a forgotten inlet where the water was usually calm, a houseboat bobbed violently against its moorings. It was an old, ugly thing, patched together with scrap wood and stubbornness, much like its owner. Alara Vance stood in the center of her small, rocking living room. At 50 years old, Alara looked like she had been carved from driftwood. She was not a tall woman, but she possessed a density of presence, a grounded strength in her shoulders and her wide, capable hands. Her hair was a steel prey, pulled back in a severe knot that defied the humidity. Her face was a map of deep lines, etched by years of witnessing trauma in emergency rooms and years of silence in this self-imposed exile. She wore a thick, oversized wool sweater that smelled of sea salt and old tea. The houseboat groaned, the timber complaining under the assault of the waves. Alara ignored it. She was busy taping an X across the glass of her only bore-old window. She moved with the economic precision of a veteran nurse, no wasted motion, no trembling. She paused only once, her gaze drifting to a small framed photograph on a shelf bolted to the wall. A young boy smiled back at her, his eyes bright with a future that never arrived. "Hold on, old Carl," she whispered, not to the photo, but to the boat. "We've seen worse." A scratching sound came from the door. It was frantic, desperate, distinct from the battering of the rain. Alara's brow furrowed. She unlatched the heavy wooden door, bracing herself against the wind that tried to rip it from her grasp. A wet, shivering bundle of fur shot inside and cowered under the table. It was Rusty. He wasn't her dog, technically. He was a stray, a scruffy terrier mix with fur the color of dried blood and one ear that stood up while the other flopped down. He belonged to the wild parts of the shoreline, but he knew where the soup bones came from. "You look like a drowned rat," Alara muttered, struggling to force the door shut again. She grabbed a rough towel from a hook and knelt. "Come here. I'm not going to hurt you." Rusty whined, his entire body vibrating. But he didn't come for the towel. He didn't come for the bowl of leftover stew she had placed on the floor. He spun in circles, barking a sharp, high-pitched sound that grated on Alara's nerves. "Hush," she scolded gently. "It's just thunder, Rusty. It's just noise." The dog ran to the door, scratched at the wood, then ran back to Alara, barking louder. He grabbed the hem of her wool sweater in his teeth and tugged. Alara froze. She knew that behavior. She had seen therapy dogs do it in the hospital wards when a patient was crashing. It was the instinct of a creature that sensed something humans were too deaf to hear. "What is it?" Alara asked, her voice dropping. "What do you hear?" Rusty let go and barked at the door again, his eyes wide and panicked. Alara Vance had spent the last 5 years trying to convince the world and herself that she didn't care anymore. She had walked away from the hospital, away from the blood, away from the impossible weight of saving lives. But the instinct was a curse she couldn't break. She grabbed her heavy oilskin coat and a flashlight. "Show me." The moment she opened the door, the storm tried to push her back inside. The wind was a physical weight, screaming in her ears. Rain lashed her face like stinging nettles. Rusty didn't hesitate. He bolted off the deck of the houseboat and onto the rocky, muddy path that lined the inlet. Alara followed, her boots sliding in the mud. The beam of her flashlight cut a weak, trembling cone through the deluge. "Rusty, wait." The dog led her away from the shelter of the inlet, out toward the base of the cliffs where the sea was churning into a white, frothy violence. The waves here were massive, crashing against the jagged rocks with the force of falling buildings. Rusty stopped at the water's edge, barking a dark shape entangled in a bed of kelp and driftwood. Alara squinted against the rain. At first she thought it was a seal, or perhaps a piece of debris from the cliffs. Then, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene in a stark blue-white aura. It was a person. "No," Alara breathed, the words snatched away by the wind. She scrambled over the slick rocks, disregarding her own safety as the icy spray soaked her to the bone. The body was lying face down, half submerged in the freezing surf. The tide was rising, and the ocean was hungry. Alara urged him. He was heavy, dead weight in the truest sense. She grabbed the back of his leather jacket and heaved, her boots seeking purchase on the slime-covered stones. He was young, she could tell by the build, but his face was buried in the sand. "Come on," she grunted, adrenaline flooding her system, banishing the ache in her joints. "Help me, damn you, move." She managed to roll him over. The sight stopped her heart for a beat. His face was a mask of blood, his skin the color of marble. His chest was barely moving. One leg was twisted at a sickening angle, and the expensive leather of his jacket was shredded, revealing raw flesh underneath. A massive wave crashed 10 feet away, sending a surge of water rushing up to her waist, threatening to drag them both out into the deep. Alara dug her heels in. She hooked her arms under his armpits. She was 50 years old, tired and alone. But tonight, she possessed the strength of a titan. She dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, up the slope of the beach. Rusty danced around them, barking encouragement, nipping at the boy's heels as if to wake him up. "I've got you," Alara shouted over the roar of the ocean, though the boy couldn't hear her. "I've got you, son. You're not dying in the mud. Not tonight." The journey back to the houseboat was a blur of pain and exertion. Every step was a battle against the wind that seemed determined to finish what the fall had started. By the time Alara kicked the door of the houseboat open and dragged the boy onto the rock of her living room, her lungs were burning like fire. She collapsed beside him,
gasping for air, water dripping from her nose and chin. The storm howled outside, furious that its prize had been stolen. Alara wiped the water from her eyes and looked down at the boy. He was broken, bleeding, and barely breathing. But he was here. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly until she placed 2 fingers against the side of his neck. A pulse. Weak. Thready. A rat. But there. Alara Vance looked at her own hands. They were stained with his blood and the mud of the storm. She took a deep breath, and the trembling stopped. The exile was over. The nurse was back.
The houseboat was no longer a home. It was a cage rattling in the jaws of a beast. Outside, the Atlantic hammered against the hull with a violence that threatened to splinter the seasoned timber. But inside, the world had shrunk to the circle of light cast by a battery-powered camping lantern. Alara Vance knelt on the rough wooden floorboards, her knees soaking up the mixture of seawater and rainwater that had trailed in with them. The boy, Leo, lay sprawled on the braided rug like a fallen soldier. His breathing was wrong, terribly, catastrophically wrong. It wasn't the rhythmic rise and fall of sleep, nor the jagged gasps of exhaustion. It was a desperate, shallow sucking sound, like a fish drowning in air. Ilara's hands, usually steady as stone, hovered over his chest. She stripped away the tattered remains of his silk shirt, the buttons popping off and skittering across the floor. Beneath the bruises that were already blooming like dark violets across his pale skin, his anatomy told a terrifying story. His right side was moving. His left was not. She pressed her ear to his chest, closing her eyes against the swaying of the boat. On the right, the faint whoosh of air. On the left, silence. Absolute, dead silence. She pulled back and looked at his throat. The trachea was shifting, pushed slightly to the right. Tension pneumothorax. His broken ribs had punctured his lung, and every breath he took was trapping air inside his chest cavity, building pressure that was slowly crushing his heart. "He's drowning on the inside," Ilara whispered to the empty room. Rusty, the wet terrier, whined from the corner, his eyes wide and reflecting the lantern light. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice cracking the whip of authority she hadn't used in years. She didn't have a crash cart. She didn't have a sterile field. She didn't have a thoracostomy tray. She had a kitchen that smelled of old coffee and a tackle box. Ilara scrambled to her feet, her shadow stretching long and distorted against the walls. She moved to the small galley kitchen, ripping open drawers. Think. Adapt. Save him. She grabbed a bottle of vodka, cheap, harsh stuff she kept for nights when the memories got too loud. Next, she pulled a fillet knife from the magnetic strip on the wall. It was a fisherman's tool, thin, flexible, and razor-sharp, designed to separate flesh from bone with brutal efficiency. Finally, she dug into a junk drawer filled with screws and fishing line until her fingers closed around a coil of clear plastic tubing, left over from an old hydration setup she'd rigged for a sick neighbor years ago. It wasn't medical grade, but it was hollow. It would have to do. She slammed the items onto the low coffee table and uncapped the vodka. She poured the clear liquid over the knife, the smell of ethanol cutting through the scent of brine and damp wool. She doused the tubing next, then her own hands, scrubbing them together until they stung. She returned to Leo. He was turning blue. Cyanosis was creeping into his lips, his fingernails. His eyes were squeezed shut, his head thrashing from side to side in a delirium of hypoxia. "I need you to hold on," Ilara hissed, positioning the lantern closer. As she leaned over him, knife in hand, Leo's eyes snapped open. They were unfocused, glassy, seeing things that weren't there. His hand, cold and clammy, shot up and gripped Ilara's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. "Mom!" he choked out. The word was a jagged shard of glass. "Mom! Don't go!" Ilara froze. The storm outside seemed to vanish. The rocking of the boat ceased. Suddenly, she wasn't in a houseboat in Iron Bay. She was back in the sterile, white-tile trauma room of St. Jude's Hospital 5 years ago. The boy on the table then hadn't been a stranger. He had been Sam. Her Sam. 20 years old, with the same unruly hair and the same terrified eyes. He had been in a gang fight. Wrong place, wrong time, a stray bullet to the abdomen. She had been the lead nurse on shift. She had held the retractors while the surgeon fought a losing battle against a severed artery. "Mom, it's cold," Sam had whispered. Ilara had held his hand, her gloves slick with his blood, telling him it was okay, lying to him as the monitor flatlined. She had watched the light leave his eyes, a candle blown out in a drafty room. That silence, the silence of a son dying while his mother watched, was the sound that had driven her to this isolation. "Mom," Leo pleaded again,
his grip tightening, pulling Alara back to the present. The grief hit her like a physical blow, a wave of nausea that nearly made her drop the knife. She looked at Leo's face. He wasn't Sam, but in the dim light, with death hovering inches above him, he was every child she had ever failed to save. "I'm here," Alara said, her voice trembling. She wasn't his mother, but she would be the lie he needed to survive. "I'm right here, but this is going to hurt." She pushed his hand down gently but firmly. She located the space between his ribs on the left side, the fifth intercostal space, mid-axillary line, a safe zone, or as safe as it got in a kitchen surgery. "Forgive me," she whispered. She didn't hesitate. Hesitation killed. She pressed the tip of the fillet knife against his skin and pushed. Leo screamed. It was a gurgling, wet sound that tore at Alara's soul, but she didn't stop. She cut through the skin, through the intercostal muscle, aiming for the pleural space. The boat lurched violently as a massive wave struck the hull, throwing Alara off balance. She pressed her elbow against the floor, keeping the knife steady, refusing to let the chaotic world dictate the precision of her hand. She withdrew the blade and immediately jammed the vodka-soaked plastic tube into the incision, using her pinky finger to guide it past the muscle wall. "Come on! Come on!" For a second, nothing happened. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Had she missed? Had the lung already collapsed too far? Then she heard it. Hiss! It was the sweetest sound she had ever heard, a sharp, high-pitched whistle of pressurized air escaping from the chest cavity. It sounded like a tire deflating, like a steam valve releasing. The tension in Leo's chest broke instantly. The trapped air rushed out through the tube, allowing the collapsed lung room to inflate. Leo gasped, a deep, ragged, beautiful intake of breath. His back arched off the rug, his mouth opening wide as oxygen flooded his starved system. The blue tint in his lips began to fade, replaced by a ghostly pallor that was at least the color of the living. Alara slumped back, sitting on her heels. The knife clattered to the floor. She watched the tube. A small amount of blood misted out with the air, but the airflow was steady. The immediate threat of cardiac arrest was gone. "Good boy," she breathed, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "That's a good boy." She secured the tube with duct tape from the tackle box, taping it securely to his side to prevent it from slipping. She rigged the other end of the tube into a half-empty water bottle, creating a primitive one-way water seal to stop air from being sucked back in. Leo's breathing leveled out. It was still harsh, still rattling with fluid, but the desperation was gone. He slipped from agony back into unconsciousness, his head lolling to the side. Alara checked his pulse. Stronger, slower. She should have felt relief. She should have felt the triumph of a life snatched back from the brink. But as she placed her hand on his forehead to brush away the wet hair, her stomach dropped. He was burning up. He'd radiated from his skin, intense and dry. The adrenaline of the procedure had masked it, but now it was undeniable. The seawater he had inhaled, the dirty rocks that had torn his skin, the time he had spent lying in the storm. It was a recipe for sepsis. She checked the wound on his leg, a nasty, jagged tear caused by the crash. The edges were angry and red, hot to the touch. Infection, Alara remembered. She looked at her supply shelf. A bottle of aspirin, some peroxide, bandages, nothing strong enough to fight what was coming. She needed broad-spectrum antibiotics. She needed IV fluids. She needed a hospital. But outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, a reminder that they were cut off from the world. Leo moaned in his sleep, a low sound of distress. "Cold," he muttered, shivering violently despite the fever raging in his blood. Alara grabbed every blanket she owned, heavy wool quilts, moth-eaten throws, and piled them over him. She pulled Rusty over, nudging the dog to lie against the boy's uninjured side for warmth. "You're not out of the woods, kid," Alara said, staring at the plastic tube jutting out of his chest, watching the small bubbles of air escape into the water bottle with every breath. "In fact, I think we just walked into the darkest part of the forest."
The rain at Dead Man's Curve did not fall. It was driven horizontally like shrapnel. General Magnus Sterling stood at the edge of the abyss, his boots sinking inches deep into the slurry of mud and gravel. He was a man composed of sharp angles and iron discipline, a four-star general who had commanded theaters of war in deserts and jungles. But tonight, the Atlantic storm reduced him to a solitary, trembling figure in the dark. His aide, a young captain named Sarah, with worry etched into her features, held a high-powered flashlight steady, though her own hands shook. The beam cut through the deluge, illuminating the jagged rocks below, but Magnus wasn't looking at the sea. He was looking at what lay at his feet. It was a helmet. Or rather, it was half of one. The expensive carbon fiber was sheared open, the visor shattered into 1,000 glittering diamonds that mixed with the wet asphalt. Inside the padding, the rain washed away a dark, sticky smear that Magnus refused to identify as blood, even though his tactical mind knew exactly what it was. He knelt, the movement stiff and mechanical. His gloved hand hovered over the wreckage of the helmet. He didn't touch it. To touch it would to make it real. "General," Captain Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind, her voice thin. "The guardrail is gone. The drop is... Sir, the drop is 100 feet into rocks. If he went over..." "Silence," Magnus growled. It wasn't a shout, but the tone carried a frequency of command that cut through the gale. He stood up, turning his back on the ocean. The grief that had threatened to drop him to his knees a moment ago was calcifying, hardening rapidly into something hotter, more volatile. It was becoming rage. "Get me the bastion," he ordered, striding back toward his black SUV. "Initiate Protocol 0. "Sir?" Sarah scrambled to keep up. "Protocol 0 is for imminent national threats. That requires Pentagon authorization. We can't use military assets for a civilian search and rescue without..." Magnus stopped. He turned on her, and in the strobing lightning, his face was a mask of terrifying resolve. "My son is not a civilian. He is my blood. And if you quote the rule book to me one more time, Captain, I will leave you on this roadside." 20 minutes later, the doors to the war room at the Iron Bay Naval Base, known locally as the Bastion, slammed open. Magnus Sterling marched in, dripping water, bringing the storm inside with him. The room was a hive of activity, bathed in the cool blue glow of tactical displays. Dozens of officers snapped to attention, silence rippling outward from the door like a shockwave. "At ease. Get to work," Magnus barked, throwing his soaked trench coat onto a chair. "I want eyes on the coastline. Sector 4, now." Colonel Hatcher, the base's second-in-command, stepped forward. Hatcher was a bureaucrat in uniform, a man of balding head and by-the-book anxiety who preferred spreadsheets to shrapnel. "General, the storm has grounded all air traffic," Hatcher said, his voice measured. "Radar is a mess. We have zero visibility." "I didn't ask for radar, Hatcher. I want thermal. Retask the orbital satellite. Punch through the cloud cover. Time and authorization codes that..." "I am the authorization." Magnus slammed his hand onto the central holo table. The glass rattled. "Do it, now." As the technicians scrambled to obey, typing furiously to redirect a multi-billion-dollar piece of hardware in orbit, Magnus stared at the blank screen. The adrenaline was fading just enough for the memory to slip through his defenses. It had been 3 hours ago. The library of the Sterling estate. The smell of old paper and brandy. Leo had stood there, holding that ridiculous violin case like a shield. He had looked so small, so fragile. "I got into the conservatory, Dad. I'm going." Magnus remembered the cement of his own voice, cold and precise. "You think the world cares about your music? The world is a wolf's den, Leo. You are a sheep trying to sing to them." He remembered grabbing the acceptance letter, the sound of tearing paper. And then the words that were now burning a hole in his gut, hotter than any ulcer. "Go then," Magnus had sneered, turning his back on his son. "Run away. You are a disappointment to me. You are the weak link in this family. If you walk out that door, don't come back until you've become a man." Leo had left. He had walked out into the rain, and Magnus had let him go. "I killed him," Magnus thought, his grip on the table tightening until his knuckles turned white. "I didn't just drive him away. I sent him into the storm." "General," a technician's voice broke his trance. "We have a lock. The signal is degraded by the moisture density, but we have heat signatures." Magnus leaned forward, his breath hitching. On the main screen, the chaotic gray static of the storm resolved into a fuzzy, top-down view of the coastline. The ocean was a mass of cold, dark blues. The land was varying shades of gray. But there, tucked into a small inlet, was a glowing orange rectangle. "An abandoned structure," the tech explained. "Old houseboat. Coordinates verify it as uninhabited for 5 years. "Then explain that," Magnus pointed. Inside the orange rectangle of the boat, there were 2 distinct spots of white-hot intensity. One was stationary. It was lying prone, its heat signature flickering, weak. The other was moving. It was pacing back and forth, moving away from the prone figure, then returning, then moving away again. Magnus's mind,
warped by guilt and years of combat strategy, didn't see a nurse tending to a patient. He didn't see a woman frantically searching for medicine. He saw a hostage situation. "He's alive," Magnus whispered, the relief washing over him so intensely he almost dizzied. But then the soldier took over. "He's alive, and someone has him." "Sir, it could be a squatter helping him," Hatcher suggested tentatively. "Helping him?" Magnus spun around, his eyes wild. "A boy crashes a motorcycle off a cliff and winds up in an abandoned boat 2 miles away? No, he was taken. Look at the movement." He pointed at the pacing figure. "That's agitation, interrogation, or worse." The image of Leo, broken and bleeding, being tormented by some unknown assailant, filled Magnus's mind. The weak link comment echoed back at him. "I called him weak. Now he needs me to be strong." "Prepare Alpha Team," he ordered. "Full extraction gear, lethal force authorized." "General, listen to me," Hatcher pleaded, stepping in front of his superior. "The wind shear is 80 knots. If you send Blackhawks up in this, they will crash. You won't save your son. You'll kill 12 good men." Magnus stared at Hatcher. He looked at the screen, at the weak pulse of heat that was his son. He looked at the storm raging against the reinforced windows of the war room. He knew Hatcher was right. Physics did not obey rank. "Fine," Magnus said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly low register. "If the sky is closed, we take the ground." "Sir, the roads are flooded. Trees are down everywhere. It's impassable." Magnus walked to the weapons locker on the far wall. He punched in his code and pulled out an assault rifle, checking the chamber with a practice click-click. He slung it over his immaculate uniform, the juxtaposition jarring. "Colonel Hatcher," Magnus said, turning to face the room. "Mobilize the heavy armor, Humvees and APCs. If a tree is in the way, we run it over. If a road is washed out, we forge a new one. I am leading the convoy personally." He walked to the door, pausing only to look back at the screen where the 2 heat signatures glowed in the dark. "I am coming for you, Leo," he muttered. "And God help whoever is in that room with you." The door swung shut, leaving the room in stunned silence. Outside, the garage bay doors began to ground open, and the deep guttural roar of diesel engines awoke, ready to tear the city apart to find one lost boy.
The hurricane lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the water-stained ribs of the houseboat. The storm outside had shifted its timbre. The screaming wind had dropped to a low, mournful moan, a deceptive lull that Ilara knew meant the eye was passing near, or the worst was gathering its breath for a second assault. Inside, the air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sharp chemical bite of rubbing alcohol. Ilara sat in a wicker chair that creaked with every shift of her weight. She hadn't moved in an hour. Her eyes were locked on the plastic tubing protruding from the boy's chest. Bubble. Pause. Bubble. Pause. It was a hypnotic, terrifying rhythm. It was the only thing proving that Leo Sterling was still tethered to this world. Rusty, the terrier, lay curled at the foot of the makeshift bed, his chin resting on his paws, watching the boy with an intensity that mirrored Ilara's. Animals knew when death was in the room. They could smell it, like ozone before lightning. Leo stirred. It started with a twitch of his fingers, then a groan that bubbled up from deep in his chest. His eyelids fluttered, heavy and papery, before peeling open. The glassy, feverish haze was still there, but behind it, Ilara saw a spark of consciousness. "Easy," Ilara whispered, leaning forward. She dipped a rag in cool water and pressed it to his forehead. "Don't try to move. You've had a very bad night." Leo blinked, trying to focus on her face. "The water," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves crushing together. "I know. I found you. You're safe now." Leo tried to take a deep breath, but the tube in his chest pulled, and he winced, a hiss of pain escaping his teeth. He looked down, seeing the bandages, the duct tape, the blood-soaked quilts. Then he looked back at Ilara, and his eyes filled with a sudden, devastating clarity. "My hands," he whispered. "Are my hands okay?" Ilara blinked, surprised. Most people asked about their legs, their spine, or the pain. "Your hands are fine, scraped, bruised, but no broken bones. I checked." Leo let out a breath that was half a sob. "Good. That's good." "You play?" Ilara asked gently, glancing at the calluses on his fingertips she had noticed earlier. "Violin.
Leo murmured, staring at the ceiling as if the wooden beams were a concert hall. "My father, he hates it. He says it's noise. He says it's for people who are too weak to hold a rifle." Ilara felt a familiar ache in her chest. She wrung out the rag, her movements slow. "Fathers can be blind, Leo. They want mirrors, not children." "I told him," Leo continued, the fever loosening his tongue. "I told him I got into the conservatory. He looked at me like I was a disease. He said I was the weak link, that I should go and not come back until I was a man." A tear leaked from the corner of his eye, tracking through the grime on his cheek. "I didn't crash because of the rain. I crashed because I didn't care if I turned the corner or not." Ilara stopped. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. She looked at this boy, broken, stitched together with fishing line and vodka, and she didn't see a stranger. She saw Sam. Sam, who hadn't wanted to join the gang, who had just wanted to fix cars and draw sketches of birds. Sam, who had been pushed by the world to be harder, meaner, until the world chewed him up and spat him out on her operating table. "You're not weak," Ilara said fiercely, her voice startling Rusty. She grabbed Leo's hand, the hand of a musician, not a soldier. "Surviving this, fighting for every breath while your lung was collapsed, that is not weakness, that is iron." Leo looked at her, really looked at her, and gave a weak, lopsided smile. "You sound like a sergeant." "I'm a nurse," she corrected, though the title felt rusty on her tongue. "Rest now. Talk later." Leo's eyes drifted shut. The exhaustion claimed him again, pulling him under. Ilara stood up, her knees popping. She needed to get him out of his wet clothes completely. The leather jacket was ruined, shredded beyond repair. She picked up the sodden pile of leather and denim she had cut off him earlier to move it to the corner. Something heavy clinked in the pocket of the jacket. Ilara paused. She reached into the ruined lining and pulled out a chain. Hanging from it were 2 rectangular metal tags, cold and dull in the lantern light. She held them up to the light, squinting to read the embossed text. Sterling, Leo, blood type AB neg, and OK, Jen M. Sterling. The air left Ilara's lungs. The tag slipped through her fingers and clattered onto the table. Sterling. In Iron Bay, you didn't need to read the newspapers to know that name. General Magnus Sterling was not just a military commander, he was a monolith. He ran the base that employed half the city and intimidated the other half. He was known as the Man of Steel, a figure of absolute authority and terrifying ruthlessness. And this broken bird on her floor was his son. Ilara looked at the window, taped over with an X. Dread coiled in her stomach like a cold snake. If Magnus Sterling found out his son was here, in a slum houseboat, being treated by a disgraced nurse with a revoked license and a bottle of vodka, he wouldn't see a savior. He would see incompetence. He would see a threat. He would tear this boat apart, and likely her with it. Worse, he would move Leo. He would drag him to a military facility, jostling that tube, risking a tension rupture, treating the boy like a piece of damaged hardware rather than a patient. "He can't know," Ilara whispered. "Not yet. Not until you're stable." She made a decision born of protective instinct and fear. She took the dog tags and shoved them deep into her own pocket. She would not call the authorities. She would not light a flare. She would save the boy first and deal with the general's wrath later. But the universe, it seemed, was not done testing her. Leo groaned in his sleep, a sound of pure distress. He kicked his leg out, and the movement was jerky, spasmodic. Ilara moved to him instantly. "Leo." He was radiating heat. It was like standing next to an open oven door. The fever had spiked, ferocious and fast. His skin was dry, papery, and flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. "No, no," he mumbled, thrashing his head. Ilara pulled back the heavy quilt to check his leg. What she saw made her blood run cold. 2 hours ago, the gash on his calf had been red and angry. Now it was a horror show. The skin around the jagged wound had turned the color of a bruised plum, darkening to a sickly black at the edges. Streaks of red were shooting up his shin, mapping the path of the infection as it marched toward his heart. The smell hit her, a sweet, rotting scent that every nurse knew. Necrosis. Gas gangrene was setting in. The bacteria from the filthy seawater were eating him alive. "Damn it," Ilara hissed. She scrambled to her medical cabinet, a rusted metal box bolted to the bathroom wall. She threw it open. Bandages, iodine, aspirin, a half-empty bottle of amoxicillin from 3 years ago. She shook the bottle. 2 pills rattled. 2 pills against a raging septic infection. It was like trying to put out a forest fire with a thimble of water.
"It's not enough," she said, her voice rising in panic. She checked the expiration date. Dust. "It's not enough." She ran back to Leo. His breathing was shallow again, faster this time. His body was fighting a war on two fronts, the collapsed lung and the blood poisoning, and he was losing. If she didn't get broad-spectrum antibiotics, heavy-duty injectable cephalosporins or vancomycin, he would be dead by sunrise. The sepsis would shut down his organs one by one. Alara looked at the window. The moaning of the wind was getting louder again. The eye of the storm was passing. The tail end was coming, and it would be vicious. She looked at Leo. He looked so much like Sam. The same jawline, the same vulnerability. She had let Sam die because she followed the rules, because she waited for the surgeon, because she trusted the system. She looked at Rusty, who whined softly. "I can't let him go," Alara told the dog. "I can't lose another one." She grabbed her heavy oilskin coat from the hook. She pulled on her thickest boots, lacing them with trembling fingers. She grabbed a flashlight, a crowbar, and the small, empty medical bag she hadn't used in 5 years. There was a place, the St. Mary's Charity Clinic. It was 10 blocks away, through the flooded lowlands. It had been shut down due to funding cuts 6 months ago. Alara knew because she used to volunteer there in secret. It was boarded up, abandoned. But they wouldn't have cleared out everything. There would be a locked storage room. There would be supplies. She knelt by Leo's ear one last time. "Leo, I have to go. Rusty is going to stay with you." Leo didn't wake, but his hand twitched, reaching out for something that wasn't there. Alara sat up, her knees popping. She needed to get him out of his wet clothes completely. The leather jacket was ruined, shredded beyond repair. She picked up the sodden pile of leather and denim she had cut off him earlier to move it to the corner. Something heavy clinked in the pocket of the jacket. Alara paused. She reached into the ruined lining and pulled out a chain. Hanging from it were 2 rectangular metal tags, cold and dull in the lantern light. She held them up to the light, squinting to read the embossed text. Sterling, Leo, blood type AB neg, NOK, Jen M. Sterling. The air left Alara's lungs. The tags slipped through her fingers and clattered onto the table. Sterling. In Iron Bay, you didn't need to read the newspapers to know that name. General Magnus Sterling was not just a military commander. He was a monolith. He ran the base that employed half the city and intimidated the other half. He was known as the Man of Steel, a figure of absolute authority and terrifying ruthlessness. And this broken bird on her floor was his son. Alara looked at the window, taped over with an X. Dread coiled in her stomach like a cold snake. If Magnus Sterling found out his son was here, in a slum houseboat, being treated by a disgraced nurse with a revoked license and a bottle of vodka, he wouldn't see a savior. He would see incompetence. He would see a threat. He would tear this boat apart, and likely her with it. Worse, he would move Leo. He would drag him to a military facility, jostling that tube, risking a tension rupture, treating the boy like a piece of damaged hardware rather than a patient. "He can't know," Alara whispered. "Not yet. Not until you're stable." She made a decision born of protective instinct and fear. She took the dog tags and shoved them deep into her own pocket. She would not call the authorities. She would not light a flare. She would save the boy first and deal with the general's wrath later. But the universe, it seemed, was not done testing her. Leo groaned in his sleep, a sound of pure distress. He kicked his leg out, and
The water hit Alara like a sledgehammer made of ice. It wasn't just rain anymore. The streets of the lowlands had become a surging, black river, fed by the overflowing storm drains and the angry Atlantic. It swirled around her thighs, thick with the taste of motor oil and the rot of the city, pulling at her legs with a strength that threatened to drag her under. Ilara Vance grit her teeth, her jaw set in a line of grim determination. She held her waterproof flashlight in one hand and a rusted crowbar in the other. Every step was a gamble. The floodwaters hid the treacherous geography of the destruction, open manholes, shattered glass, downed power lines that hissed like dying snakes where they touched the surface. She pushed forward, leaning into the gale. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the dockyard cranes, creating a mournful, metallic symphony. She was 50 years old, her joints ached with the damp cold, and she was exhausted. But the image of the boy in her houseboat, his skin turning the color of ash, the black veins of sepsis creeping up his leg, burned in her mind, hotter than the cold could extinguish. "Not again," she chanted internally, a rhythm to match her trudging steps. "I will not lose another one." 10 blocks. It felt like 10 miles. She passed submerged cars that looked like sleeping whales, their alarms long since drowned out. She saw the dark shapes of rats clinging to floating pallets, their eyes reflecting her flashlight beam.
3 miles to the west, the storm was fighting a different kind of intruder. General Magnus Sterling sat in the lead Humvee of the armored column, his knuckles white as he gripped the dashboard handle. The convoy was a line of brutalist steel monsters, usually unstoppable, but nature was the one enemy that did not respect rank. "Stop!" the driver yelled, slamming on the brakes. The Humvee skidded, fishtailing in the mud before coming to a halt. The headlights illuminated a scene of absolute blockage. A massive ancient pine tree, its roots torn from the earth by the hurricane-force winds, lay across the logging road. Beyond it, a slurry of mud and boulders from a landslide had buried the asphalt. "Reverse," Magnus barked. "Go around." "We can't, sir," the driver replied, panic edging his voice. "The banks on both sides are washed out. If we turn, we roll." Magnus stared at the obstruction. The heat signature on the satellite display burned in his memory. 2 figures, one unmoving, one pacing. Torture, his mind supplied. They are hurting him. Every second this convoy stalled was a second of agony for his son. He kicked the door open. The wind tried to rip it from its hinges, but he shoved it outward and jumped into the mud. The rain was torrential, soaking his uniform instantly, plastering his silver hair to his skull. He marched to the fallen tree, grabbing a branch and pulling. It didn't budge. It was immutable, indifferent physics. Colonel Hatcher scrambled out of the second vehicle, running to catch up. "General, we need to wait for the combat engineers to bring up the dozers. It will take an hour to clear this." "We don't have an hour." Magnus turned, his face illuminated by the headlights, terrifying in its intensity. He looked at the soldiers peering out from the armored trucks, young men trained for desert warfare, looking at the dark, flooded forest with trepidation. Magnus unslung his assault rifle. "Dismount," he roared, his voice cutting through the thunder. "All of you, leave the vehicles. We move on foot." "Sir?" Hatcher gaped. "It's 3 miles through dense terrain in a Category 2 hurricane." "Then you better start running, Colonel," Magnus snarled. He turned and began climbing over the trunk of the fallen pine, his boots finding purchase on the wet bark. "Alpha team, on me! Move! Move!" The soldiers scrambled out, boots hitting the mud. They saw their general, a man who usually commanded from a glass tower, clawing his way through the debris like a possessed infantryman. Fear of the storm was replaced by fear of him. They followed. Ilara reached St. Mary's Charity Clinic. It was a brick building that had seen better days even before it was abandoned. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had grayed with rot. She didn't bother with the front door. She went around the back, wading through waist-deep water in the alleyway. She found the steel service door. It was locked, rusted shut. "Come on," she grunted, jamming the crowbar into the seam. She leaned her entire body weight against it. The metal groaned, protesting. Ilara slipped, her face smashing against the wet brick, splitting her lip. She tasted copper. She didn't stop. She repositioned the bar and pulled again, screaming with the effort. For Sam, for Leo. With a loud crack, the rusty lock gave way. The door swung open, and Ilara tumbled inside, landing on dry, dusty linoleum. The silence inside was heavy, smelling of stale antiseptic and mold. She clicked her flashlight on. The beam swept across overturned gurneys and empty waiting chairs. This was where she used to volunteer, stitching up fishermen who couldn't afford insurance and addicts who had nowhere else to go. She ran to the pharmacy storage room. The door was glass-paneled. She didn't hesitate. She shattered it with the crowbar, the glass raining down like diamonds. She scanned the shelves. Most were empty, picked clean by scavengers, or moved when the clinic closed. "Please," she whispered, "please don't be empty." She shoved aside boxes of gauze and expired saline. There, at the back of the bottom shelf, tucked behind a box of latex gloves, was a small, dusty cooler. Ilara flipped the lid. Inside, resting in a plastic tray, were 4 vials, vancomycin, the heavy artillery. She grabbed them, her hands shaking, and shoved them into her waterproof bag. She grabbed a handful of syringes and a bottle of sterile water for mixing. "Got you," she breathed. She turned to leave, adrenaline masking her exhaustion. She made it to the back exit, stepping out into the alleyway. 2 beams of light hit her face, blinding her. "Well, well," a scratchy voice sneered from the darkness. "Look what the tide washed up." Ilara shielded her eyes. Through the rain, she saw 2 figures blocking the alley exit. The first, the one speaking, was a tall, skeletal man with rotting teeth and a machete hanging loosely in his hand. Let's call him Skulker. The second was shorter, broader, holding a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. Scavengers, looters who preyed on the evacuations. "Get out of my way," Ilara said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "That's a nice bag," Skulker said, stepping closer. The water swirled around his knees. "Pharmacy's closed, lady. Anything you got belongs to the tax collectors. That's us." "It's just medicine," Ilara lied, "for a sick dog." "We'll take it," the squad man grunted. "And the flashlight. And the code." They lunged. Ilara didn't scream. She didn't cower. She had spent 20 years in an ER. She knew how fragile the human body was, and she knew exactly where to hurt it. As Skulker swung the machete, Ilara dropped to one knee into the water. The blade whistled over her head, embedding and softened the doorframe.
She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, unlabeled spray bottle, her homemade concoction of rubbing alcohol and concentrated chili oil, brewed for stray dogs that got too aggressive. She aimed for Skulka's face and squeezed the trigger. The stream hit him square in the eyes. He shrieked, a sound of pure agony, dropping the machete to claw at his burning face. The squat man roared and swung the bat. Ilara tried to dodge, but the water slowed her down. The bat missed her head but struck her shoulder with a sickening thud. She fell back, splashing into the filth. He raised the bat for a finishing blow. Ilara's hand found the fallen machete in the water. She didn't swing it. She thrust it upward blindly. The tip caught the squat man in the thigh. He howled, staggering back, clutching his leg. Ilara scrambled up, gasping. Pain radiated from her shoulder, hot and blinding. Skulker was recovering, blinking tears from his eyes, reaching for her. "You witch!" he screamed. He lunged again, a small knife appearing in his other hand. Ilara turned to run, but he was past. The knife slashed across the back of her left shoulder, slicing through the oilskin coat and deep into the muscle. The pain was a white flash, shocking and immediate. Ilara cried out but didn't stop. She kicked Skulker in the knee with her heavy boot, feeling the joint pop, and sprinted, or as close to sprinting as she could in waist-deep water, out of the alley. She didn't look back. She ran through the pain, ran through the blood that was now warm and sticky running down her back, mixing with the cold rain. She clutched the bag of medicine to her chest like a newborn child. The journey back was a haze. Ilara moved on autopilot, her body failing but her will driving her forward. She slipped on the rocks near the inlet, scraping her palms, but she crawled the last 50 yards. She practically fell through the door of the houseboat. Rusty was barking, a frantic warning sound. Ilara kicked the door shut and bolted it. She collapsed onto the floor, dragging herself toward Leo. The boy was convulsing. His eyes were rolled back, his skin radiating heat like a furnace. The black streaks on his leg had climbed higher. "I'm here," Ilara gasped, her vision tunneling. Her shoulder was throbbing in time with her heartbeat, blood soaking her sweater. She forced her hands to work. She popped the cap off the vancomycin vial. She drew up the sterile water. Her hands were covered in mud and her own blood, but she kept the needle sterile. She mixed the solution, shaking it violently. She tied a tourniquet around Leo's arm. His veins were collapsed, hard to find. "Come on, Leo. Give me something." She found a faint blue line. She inserted the needle. Flash of blood. She was in. She pushed the plunger slowly. "Fight," she whispered, tears finally mixing with the rain on her face. "You fight, Leo Sterling." As she pulled the needle out and tossed it aside, a sound cut through the storm outside. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the thunder. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots hitting the wooden dock. Lots of them, and the low, aggressive bark of men who were hunting. Magnus was here. Ilara slumped against the wall, clutching her bleeding shoulder, and looked at the unconscious boy. She had saved him from the infection, she hoped, but now she had to save him from his father.
Dawn broke over Iron Bay, not with a whisper, but with the silence of a held breath. The storm, having raged for 12 hours with biblical fury, had finally exhausted itself. The sky was a bruised purple healing into a pale, indifferent blue. Sunlight, sharp and cold, sliced through the gaps in the clouds, illuminating a city that looked like a shipwreck. The water in the inlet, so violent the night before, was now unnaturally glassy, covered in a film of debris, driftwood, plastic bottles, and the shattered remains of the docks. Inside the houseboat, the silence was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic bubbling of the chest tube apparatus. Ilara Vance sat in the wicker chair, her head tipped back against the wall. She hadn't slept. She couldn't. Her left shoulder, hastily bandaged with duct tape and gauze over the knife wound she'd sustained at the clinic, throbbed with a hot, sickening pulse. Every heartbeat sent a fresh spike of pain down her arm, but she welcomed it. The pain kept her awake. The pain kept her guard up. She looked at the boy. Leo Sterling was no longer thrashing. The vancomycin had hit his system like a sledgehammer. His skin, previously flushed with the angry heat of sepsis, was now pale and clammy, but cool. The red streaks on his leg had stopped climbing. He was still alive. Leo shifted, his eyelashes fluttering. He opened his eyes, and for the first time since the crash, they were clear. The delirium was gone, replaced by a raw, confused exhaustion. "You came back," Leo whispered, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. Ilara forced a smile, though it pulled tight against her exhaustion. "I told you I would. Nurses don't abandon their patients." Leo tried to sit up, but the tube in his chest pulled tight, forcing a hiss of air through his teeth. He fell back against the pillows. His eyes traveled to Ilara's shoulder, seeing the dark stain seeping through the thick wool of her sweater. "You're bleeding," he said, realization dawning on his face. "You got hurt. Because of me." "It's just a scratch, Leo. A price of doing business in the lowlands."
Ilara reached out with her good arm, brushing the hair from his forehead. "The important thing is that the fever broke. You beat the infection." Leo looked at the ceiling, tears pooling in his eyes. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why did you do all this? You don't even know me." Ilara looked at the sunlight dancing on the floorboards. She thought of Sam. She thought of the empty years, the silence she had wrapped around herself like a shroud. "Because you were drowning," she said simply, "and I was tired of watching people drown." The moment hung between them, fragile and honest. But then, the water in the glass jar beside the bed, the primitive seal for his lung, began to tremble. Ripples appeared on the surface of the water, concentric circles vibrating from the center. Rusty, the terrier who had been sleeping at Leo's feet, shot up. A low, guttural growl vibrated in his throat. His hackles rose, a ridge of stiff fur along his spine. "What is it, boy?" Ilara whispered. Then she heard it. It started as a low thrumming, felt in the teeth before it was heard by the ears, a rhythmic thwup, thwup, thwup that grew louder with every second, vibrating the very timbers of the boat. It wasn't the wind, it was mechanical. It was the sound of heavy machinery displacing air. Ilara struggled to her feet, clutching her injured shoulder. She moved to the window, peering through the gap in the X of tape. The sun was blinding, reflecting off the water, but through the glare she saw them. Two black shapes rising over the tree line like prehistoric predatory insects. UH-60 Blackhawks. They were coming in low and fast, their rotors kicking up a spray of mist from the calm water. The sound became a roar, a physical pressure that rattled the jars on the shelves. "No," Ilara breathed. On the shore, movement caught her eye. The tree line, usually tense and green, was suddenly alive with unnatural shapes. Humvees, mud-caked and battered from their journey through the storm-ravaged forest, were tearing through the brush, crushing saplings under their tires. Soldiers in full tactical gear were spilling out, moving with terrifying precision. They fanned out along the rocky beach, weapons raised, flanking the dock. They were surrounding the boat. "He found me," Leo whimpered. Ilara turned. The boy was white as a sheet, his eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the physical pain. He wasn't looking at the window. He was staring at the door, shrinking back into the pillows as if trying to disappear. "He found me," Leo repeated, his voice rising in panic. He thinks I ran away. He thinks I'm weak. He's going to lock me away." He tried to rip the tape off his chest, his hands shaking violently. "I have to go. I have to get up." "Leo, stop." Ilara lunged forward, grabbing his wrists. "If you pull that tube out, your lung will collapse again. You will die in minutes." "Let him take me," Leo sobbed, the trauma of the accident colliding with the trauma of his father's rejection. "He's coming to punish me. You don't know him. You don't know what he's like when he's angry." "I don't care who he is," Ilara said fiercely. The sound of the helicopters was deafening now, hovering directly overhead. The downdraft was shaking the houseboat violently, knocking pictures off the walls. Dust motes danced in the chaotic air. "Listen to me," Ilara shouted over the roar. She pinned Leo's shoulders to the mattress, not with force, but with a grounding weight. "You are my patient, and in this boat, I am the ranking officer. Do you hear me?" Leo looked up at her, trembling. "I am here," Ilara said. Her voice dropped to a fierce whisper that somehow cut through the noise. She moved her body, placing herself between Leo and the door. She wasn't a large woman. She was injured, exhausted, and unarmed. But in that moment, she was a fortress. "No one touches you. No one hurts you. Not while I'm breathing." Outside, a voice amplified by a megaphone boomed, distorted and harsh. "This is the United States military. Occupants of the vessel, exit with your hands visible. You have 10 seconds. Ilara didn't move toward the door. She stood her ground, shielding the boy. "Breach! Breach! Breach!" The warning was barely registered before the world exploded. There was no knock. There was no negotiation. A shaped charge placed on the hinges of the heavy wooden door detonated with a concussive crump. Wood splintered and flew inward like shrapnel. Smoke billowed into the small living space, acrid and gray. Ilara flinched, turning her back to the explosion to shield Leo from the debris. Before the smoke could clear, they were inside. Men in black tactical gear, faceless behind gas masks and ballistic helmets, poured into the room like oil. They moved with a speed that was impossible to track. "Hands! Let me see hands! Get down!"
"Get on the ground!" The shouts were overlapping, aggressive, designed to disorient and terrify. Dozens of red laser dots danced through the smoke, cutting through the haze like angry hornets. They swept across the room, over the kitchen counter, over the medical supplies, over Rusty, who was barking frantically from the corner. Then, they all converged on one point: Elara's chest. 5, 6, 7 red dots settled on her wool sweater, directly over her heart. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, but she didn't step aside. She stood with her legs planted, her body forming a human barrier between the assault team and the bed where Leo lay gasping. "Don't shoot," Elara screamed, her voice raw. "He's injured. He's on life support. Don't shoot." The soldiers hesitated for a fraction of a second, their training conflicting with the scene before them. They expected a kidnapper. They expected a threat. They found a middle-aged woman with gray hair and a bloody shoulder, standing over a boy hooked up to a kitchen table surgery rig. Then, the wall of black uniforms parted. A figure stepped through the breach. He didn't wear a mask. He didn't wear a helmet. He was caked in mud from boots to collar. His silver hair was plastered to his skull with sweat and rain. His uniform was torn, his face scratched by branches. General Magnus Sterling looked like a man who had crawled out of hell to drag someone back with him. In his hands he held an assault rifle, the stock pressed tight against his shoulder, his finger resting on the trigger guard. His eyes were terrifying, bloodshot, rimmed with dark circles, burning with a frantic, lethal intensity. He swept the room, ignoring Elara entirely, his gaze locking onto the figure on the bed. He saw the tubes, he saw the blood, he saw the stillness of his son. But his mind, poisoned by grief and the tactical assumption of a hostage scenario, snapped. He swung the rifle barrel toward Elara. "Step away from him," Magnus snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that shook the room more than the explosives had. "Step away, or I will put you down right where you stand." The laser from his rifle settled directly between Elara's eyes. Leo tried to scream, "Dad, no!" But his voice was a weak croak, lost in the noise. Elara stared down the barrel of the gun. She looked into the eyes of the man who could end her life with a twitch of his finger. She saw the madness there. She saw the father who thought he was too late. She didn't blink. She didn't move. "He needs oxygen," she said, her voice calm, icy, and defying every instinct of self-preservation. "If you shoot me, you shoot the only person who knows how to keep your son alive." Magnus tightened his grip. The tendon in his jaw popped. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving only the hum of the lasers and the ragged breathing of two parents. One fighting to save a life, the other ready to take one to save his child.
The laser sight was a burning red eye on Elara Vance's forehead. It did not waver. Behind the rifle, General Magnus Sterling was a statue of compressed violence, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. In his mind, he was not looking at a woman. He was looking at an obstacle. He was looking at a captor who had bound his son with tubes and tape in a floating shack. "I said, step away," Magnus repeated. His voice was no longer a shout. It was a whisper, terrifyingly calm, the voice of a man who had already made the decision to kill. Elara felt the cold kiss of mortality on her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her feet remained rooted to the floorboards. She could feel Leo trembling behind her, the vibration traveling through the mattress to her legs. "He has a tension pneumothorax," Elara said, her voice shaking but distinct. She spoke the medical terms like a shield, a language of healing thrown against a weapon of war. "The tube in his chest is the only thing keeping his heart beating. If I move, the seal breaks. If the seal breaks, he dies. If you shoot me, he dies." Magnus blinked. The words hit him, but they didn't penetrate the armor of his rage. He saw the duct tape. He saw the blood on the floor. He saw the knife on the table. "You cut him," Magnus snarled, stepping closer, the barrel of the rifle inches from her face. "I see the blood. You tortured him." "Cha!" The scream was weak, a ragged tear in the suffocating tension. It came from the bed, wet and desperate. Magnus froze. His eyes flicked from Elara to the figure behind her. Leo had pushed himself up on one elbow, his face gray with exhaustion, sweat matting his hair to his forehead. He looked at his father with wide, pleading eyes,
eyes that Magnus had expected to be dead. "Stop," Leo wheezed, the effort costing him precious oxygen. Don't hurt her." Magnus's grip on the rifle loosened, just a fraction. "Leo." "She saved me," Leo choked out, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. He reached out, his hand grasping the back of Alara's wool sweater. "The ocean, I was drowning. She pulled me out. She fixed me." The silence that followed was louder than the explosion that had breached the door. Magnus stood paralyzed, the cognitive dissonance crashing through his mind like a physical blow. The narrative he had constructed, the kidnapping, the torture, the enemy, was fracturing. "Medical," Magnus barked, though the fire had gone out of his voice, front and center, now. A soldier pushed past the general. It was Lieutenant Gorman, the unit's lead combat medic. He was a younger man, sharp-eyed and efficient, carrying a heavy trauma kit. He didn't look at Alara with hostility. He looked at her with professional curiosity. "Ma'am, step aside," Gorman said, firm but not aggressive. "Let me assess him." Alara hesitated, her protective instinct warring with the reality of the situation. She looked at Gorman, assessing him in turn. She saw competence in his hands. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped back, but she stayed within arm's reach. "Careful with the tube," she warned, her voice raspy. "It's improvised, vinyl tubing, water seal. Don't jostle it." Gorman knelt by the bed. He activated a pen light, checking Leo's pupils, then moved his hands to the boy's chest. He examined the duct tape, the plastic tube, the way it disappeared between the ribs. He traced the line to the water bottle on the floor, watching the bubbles rise with Leo's breath. He looked at the table. He saw the empty vodka bottle. He saw the fillet knife with dried blood on the handle. He saw the fishing line used for sutures. Gorman stopped. He looked up at Magnus, his expression one of pure, unadulterated shock. "General," Gorman said, his voice quiet. "Report," Magnus demanded, though he was staring at the floor, his rifle lowered to his hip. "Sir, this isn't torture," Gorman said, standing up and wiping his hands on his vest. He gestured to the crude setup. "This is a thoracostomy, a chest tube insertion. But, sir, she did it with a kitchen knife and a piece of hydration tubing." Magnus looked up, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." "Your son's long head collapsed," Gorman continued, shaking his head in disbelief. Pressure was building up in his chest. It would have killed him in minutes. She cut him open to release the air. And the sutures. He leaned in closer to inspect the wound on Leo's leg. "These stitches are perfect, and she's pushed heavy antibiotics, vancomycin by the smell of it." Gorman turned to Alara, a new respect in his eyes. "You did this, in the dark, on a moving boat." "I had to," Alara said simply, clutching her wounded shoulder. He couldn't wait for the storm to break. "General," Magnus turned back to his commander. "I've seen surgeons in sterile theaters struggle with this procedure. She did it with garbage and vodka. She didn't just help him, sir. She dragged him back from the dead. If she hadn't cut him open when she did, we'd be recovering a body right now." The rifle slipped from Magnus's hands. It hit the wooden floor with a heavy, dull clatter that made everyone jump, except Alara. Magnus stared at the knife on the table. He stared at the tube in his son's chest. And then, he turned his gaze to Alara. For the first time, he really looked at her. He didn't see an enemy. He saw a woman standing in a puddle of water, wearing a sweater that was too big for her. He saw the gray hair escaping her messy bun. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of her face, the dark circles under her eyes that mirrored her own. And he saw the blood. A dark, wet stain was spreading rapidly across her left shoulder, soaking the gray wool crimson. It was fresh. It was bleeding freely. "You're hurt," Magnus whispered. "I ran into some trouble getting the medicine." Alara dismissed it, though her knees were beginning to shake. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the pain. "You went out in the storm?" Magnus asked, his voice cracking. "You left safety, to get medicine for my son." "He had sepsis," Alara said. "He needed the drugs." The walls of General Magnus Sterling, the man of steel, the strategist, the warrior, crumbled. They didn't fall slowly, they disintegrated. He looked at his son, alive, breathing, looking back at him with fear and hope. He looked at this stranger, this woman who had absolutely no reason to care, who had been threatened, injured, and held at gunpoint, and who had still stood between a boy and a bullet. Magnus took a step forward. Alara flinched, bracing herself. But Magnus didn't strike. He didn't yell. He fell. The general's knees hit the wet floorboards with a thud. He collapsed not from injury, but from the sheer, crushing weight of gratitude and shame. He bowed his head, his forehead resting against the edge of the mattress where his son lay.
A sound escaped him, a ragged, guttural sob that seemed to tear his throat. It was the sound of a baron realizing how close they had come to the abyss. "Sir," Gorman stepped forward, alarmed. Magnus held up a hand to stop him. He kept his head down for a long moment, his shoulders heaving. Then slowly he lifted his face. His eyes were swimming in tears, stripping away all rank, all pretense. He reached out. He didn't reach for his son yet. He reached for Alara. He took her good hand in both of his hands. His large, calloused hands, hands that had signed airstrike orders and held weapons, were trembling violently. He brought her hand to his forehead, pressing it against his skin in a gesture of absolute submission and reverence. "I almost killed you," he choked out, the tears dripping onto her knuckles. "God forgive me, I almost killed the woman who saved my life." "General," Alara started, stunned. "No," Magnus interrupted, looking up at her. "Not General, just a father. A stupid, blind father." He squeezed her hand, terrified to let go. "Look at what you did. You bled for him. I sat in a tank and drove in to save him, but you gave your blood for him." He looked at the wound on her shoulder again, and a flash of anger returned, but this time, it was directed at himself, at the world that had hurt her. "Gorman," Magnus shouted, his voice thick but commanded. "Get a field dressing on her shoulder, now. Treat her before you treat anyone else." "Sir, the boy is stable because she made him stable," Magnus roared, though he never let go of Alara's hand. "She is the priority. Do it." Gorman rushed over, cutting away the fabric of Alara's sweater to expose the nasty slash wound. Alara hissed in pain, swaying on her feet. Magnus stood up then, catching her before she could fall. He held her upright, his arms supporting her weight with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man of his size. "I am so sorry," he whispered into her ear, his voice breaking. "I am so desperately sorry. I will spend the rest of my life trying to earn the forgiveness for what I almost did today." Alara looked up at him. She saw the regret burning in his eyes. She looked past him to Leo, who was watching them with a weak smile, his hand reaching out toward his father. "Go to him," Alara whispered, gently pushing Magnus away. "He's been waiting for you." Magnus hesitated, looking at her one last time as if she were a saint who had descended to earth. Then, he turned and rushed to the bed, burying his face in his son's neck, sobbing the name he thought he would never get to say again. Alara leaned against the wall as the medic dressed her wound. She watched the reunion, the father weeping, the son forgiving, and for the first time in 5 years, the cold emptiness in her chest began to fill with something warm.
The Iron Bay Grand Theater was a cathedral of velvet and gold, a stark contrast to the rust and steel that defined the rest of the city. Usually the air here smelled of expensive perfume and old money, but tonight there was a different scent cutting through the pretension: shoe polish and gun oil. In the center row, taking up 6 seats that were far too small for their frames, sat the members of Alpha Team. They were dressed in their dress blues, medals gleaming under the crystal chandeliers, looking uncomfortable but fiercely attentive. Lieutenant Gorman, the medic who had bandaged Alara's shoulder 3 months ago, fiddled with his collar, looking less like a lethal operator and more like a nervous older brother at a recital. Beside them sat General Magnus Sterling. The man of steel was unrecognizable. The perpetual scowl that had etched deep lines around his mouth was gone, replaced by a look of quiet, intense anticipation. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He wore a simple black tuxedo, and for the first time in decades, he didn't look like he was inspecting the room for threats. He was just looking at the stage. Next to him sat Alara Vance. She wore a gown of deep navy silk, a gift from Magnus that she had tried to refuse 3 times. It covered the jagged pink scar on her shoulder, a permanent reminder of the night the storm broke. Her gray hair was pulled back elegantly, and her hands, usually rough from salt and work, rested gently on the velvet armrest. She looked regal, not because of the dress, but because of the peace that radiated from her. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the audience, silencing the whispers of the city's elite who were still trying to understand why the terrifying General Sterling was sitting next to a former recluse from the boatyards. A spotlight cut through the darkness. Leo Sterling walked onto the stage. He walked with a slight limp. The leg was healed, but the memory of the break remained in his gait. He wore a crisp white shirt, the top button undone, revealing the faint top edge of a scar that ran between his ribs. He carried his violin not as a weapon, nor as a shield, but as an extension of his soul. He stood center stage, looking small against the vast backdrop, yet commanding the space. He raised the bow. He didn't look at the music sheet. He looked straight at the center row. He looked at Alara. He began to play. The piece was not Bach or Beethoven. It was something new, something raw. It started with a low, discordant screech, the sound of wind tearing through metal, the sound of tires losing grip on wet asphalt. It was the storm. The notes tumbled over each other, chaotic and violent, making the audience shift in their seats. But then the tempo shifted. The chaos broke into a desperate, gasping melody. High, thin notes that sounded like a struggle for breath. It was the sound of a lung collapsing, of a life flickering out. Magnus gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. He remembered that sound. He remembered the thermal image of his dying son. But then the music changed again. A warm, steady rhythm emerged from the lower strings. It was a heartbeat, strong, resilient. The melody soared above it, no longer gasping, but breathing deep and full. It was the sound of air rushing into a chest. It was the sound of a knife cutting to heal, not to harm. Leo closed his eyes, his body swaying with the music. He poured everything into the wood and strings, the fear of the fall, the pain of the incision, the warmth of the houseboat, and the voice of the woman who had refused to let him die. In the audience, Lieutenant Gorman wiped his eyes, pretending to adjust his glasses. The other soldiers sat stone still, captivated by the boy they had once breached a door to rescue, realizing now that he possessed a bravery different from their own. Alara didn't cry. She watched Leo's hands, the hands she had worried would never play again, dancing over the fingerboard. She felt a swelling in her chest that was so large it hurt. It wasn't just pride, it was the return of feeling. The numbness that had plagued her since Sam's death was gone, burned away by the fire of that stormy night. Leo drew the final note out, a long, shimmering vibrato that hung in the air like a prayer. Silence. For 3 seconds, the theater was absolutely silent. Then, Magnus Sterling stood up. He didn't elap politely. He applauded with a ferocity that startled the people around him. And then the soldiers stood. And then the elite of Iron Bay stood. The ovation was a thunder of its own, washing over the boy on stage. Leo lowered his bow, breathless, sweat shining on his forehead. He smiled, a real dazzling smile that reached his eyes, and bowed deeply to the woman in the navy dress. Later, the grand lobby was a swirl of champagne and congratulations. But the trio moved away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner near the balcony doors. That was... Magnus started, his voice thick. He cleared his throat, struggling to find the words. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Leo looked at his father, bracing for a critique that never came. You didn't think it was weak? Magnus shook his head, slowly. He reached out and placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. Not a heavy hand of command, but a grounding touch of connection. I was wrong, Leo. Strength isn't just about holding a rifle or giving orders. What you did up there, bearing your soul like that is the bravest thing I know. I am so proud of you. Leo's breath hitched. He stepped forward and hugged his father. It wasn't the stiff, formal embrace of the past. It was a collision. Magnus held him tight, burying his face in his son's hair, closing his eyes against the sting of tears. Alara watched them, a soft smile playing on her lips. She turned to leave, to give them their moment, but a hand caught hers. Don't you dare, Magnus said gently, pulling her into the circle. I should get back, Alara said, gesturing vaguely toward the exit. The center opens at 6 a.m. I have inventory to check. The inventory is done, Magnus said. I had a supply truck drop off the new shipments this afternoon, and the new MRI machine is installed. The Sterling Vance Community Medical Center. It wasn't a houseboat anymore. In the weeks following the storm, Magnus had waged a different kind of war. He had stormed the city council, the medical board, and the zoning commission. He had used every ounce of his terrifying influence not to destroy, but to build. He had forced the medical board to reinstate Alara's nursing license, exposing the bureaucratic scapegoating that had ruined her career years ago. He had bought the land around the inlet, cleared the debris, and built a state-of-the-art clinic to serve the forgotten people of the lowlands. Alara Vance was no longer the witch of the boatyard. She was the director of nursing. You do too much, Magnus, Alara scolded, though her eyes were warm. I am paying a debt, Magnus said seriously. He turned to face her fully, ignoring the curious glances of the socialites around them. He took her hands, his thumbs tracing the rough skin of her palms.
You saved his life, Magnus said, nodding toward Leo. That is a debt I can never repay. But Alara, when you stood in front of my rifle, when you forced me to look at what I had become, he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that only she could hear. You didn't just save the boy, you saved the human part of me. I was a machine, Alara. I was cold steel. You broke me open and showed me that I could still feel. Alara squeezed his hands. We saved each other, Magnus. I was drowning too. I just didn't know it. Hey, Leo said, grinning, slinging his arm around Alara's uninjured shoulder. Are we going to get emotional all night, or are we going to the beach? Rusty is waiting in the car, and I promised him a run. The beach at the inlet was unrecognizable from the nightmare of 3 months ago. The moon was a perfect crescent, hanging over a sea that whispered rather than roared. The jagged rocks of Dead Man's Curve were silhouetted against the stars, no longer menacing, just a part of the landscape. Rusty, the terrier who had once been a shivering stray, was now a glossy, well-fed dog wearing a collar with a shiny tag. He tore down the shoreline, chasing the frothy edge of the tide, barking with pure, unadulterated joy. Leo walked ahead, his shoes off, letting the cold water wash over his feet. He looked light, unburdened. Alara and Magnus walked behind him, side by side. They didn't touch, but the space between them was charged with a quiet intimacy. I still have the boat, Alara said, watching the moonlight dance on the water. It's docked behind the clinic, Magnus nodded. I had the engineers reinforce the hull. It won't sink. Good, Alara smiled. It's a good reminder that storms pass. Magnus stopped. He looked out at the horizon, where the dark water met the dark sky. Yes, they pass, but only if you have an anchor. He looked at Alara. The moonlight caught the silver in her hair and the strength in her jaw. You are my anchor, Alara, he said softly. Alara looked at him, and then at Leo, laughing as Rusty shook water all over him. She thought of the fear, the blood, the vodka, and the gun. It seemed like a different lifetime. She took Magnus's arm, leaning into him as the cool breeze rolled off the ocean. Come on, General, she said. Let's go home. They walked on, 3 survivors and a dog, leaving footprints in the sand that the gentle waves would soon wash away, leaving the beach clean, new, and ready for the morning sun.
In our daily lives, we are often like the characters in Iron Bay. We build walls like Alara to protect our hearts from past pain, or we wear armor like Magnus to hide our fear of losing control. We judge others by their scars or their status, forgetting that the strongest souls are often the ones fighting battles we cannot see. This story reminds us that true strength is not found in never falling. It is found in who catches you when you do. It teaches us that isolation is not safety, and vulnerability is not weakness. Sometimes the person we think is the weak link is actually the one holding us together. Don't wait for a life-altering storm to tear down your walls. Reach out to the people you love today. Forgive the ones who didn't know how to love you right. Be the anchor for someone drifting in the dark, because in the end, we are all just walking each other home. I pray that whatever storm you are facing right now, whether it is sickness, loneliness, or a broken relationship, that you find your anchor. May God heal the wounds you hide from the world, just as He brought healing to this broken family. May He give you the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to forgive, and the peace that always comes after the rain. If you receive this blessing and believe in the power of second chances, please write Amen in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and share it with a friend or family member who needs a reminder that they are not alone. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that feeds the soul. God bless you, and until next time, keep the faith.